So we'll go silent here for a few seconds, and we should begin very shortly. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
IFPRI, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our virtual audience. Welcome very much to today's seminar, which IFPRI is very pleased to co-host with the Food Systems Economic Commission and the FAO on tackling the hidden cost of our food systems. My name is Charlotte Hebebrand. I'm the Director of Communications and Public Affairs here at IFPRI. So our speakers today will focus on two recently released major reports on the topic of hidden cost, both of which call attention to this important topic, and we'll discuss the different types of costs, what they add up to, and most importantly, offer solutions on how these can be addressed. We'll be coming to a Q&A session in this seminar, and we would love to hear from all of you here in person and online. To participate in our Q&A session, you can take the mic here if you're here in person, or for those of you online, please submit your questions on ifpri.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or by using the hashtag AskIFPRI on X. And it's now my pleasure to turn the floor over to IFPRI's Director General, Johan Swinnen, who also serves as the Commissioner of the Food Systems Economics Commission. Jo, thanks for kicking off our discussion today.
Good morning, everybody here in Washington, and good afternoon, good evening, colleagues from around the world. It's a great pleasure for me to open this event today for a number of reasons. I mean, I have been part for almost over 3 years, I think, of the Food Systems Economics Commission, together with experts from around the world, actually also Maximo Torero, our friend and the chief economist from FAO, was part of the commission, and we will hear from Katerina in a bit on some of the results of it. It's great also to launch this or to co-host this event with FSEC and with the FAO with the launch of their report as well, their annual report, which has some major insights on the same topic. I think the topic that we're tackling today is really very important. I don't think I need to convince you, otherwise you probably wouldn't be participating here in the event or in online. Food systems are facing many challenges. Okay, one of them is that at this point, more than 3 billion people on the planet, which is a really large share of the total population, cannot afford a healthy diet, and at the same time, we have all kinds of challenges related to the sustainability of the food system. Now, the realization among experts has been there for a long time, but let's say for the broader policy community, it has taken some time. But recently, in the COP28, there was this declaration on sustainable agriculture, resilient food systems, and climate action, and that was signed by more than 130 countries, really bringing this probably to the forefront more explicitly and more strongly than ever before. We know, however, that the changes that are needed are not easy, and the current geopolitical circumstances may make it more difficult, less easy to find a solution, particularly to implement the solution, I would say. So we are facing almost daily shocks caused by climate change, by conflict which is spreading around the world or which is more acute than it has been for many decades. We still have the lingering effects of COVID-19, particularly, for example, on budgets in developing and emerging countries. And the war in Ukraine continues to have impacts on the volatility of our food systems. We see this also in several expressions of discontent around the world. I think this is in a very important year of elections around the world, and many of these elections are affected by disagreements on transformation in general and food system transformation more particularly. We see this in many demonstrations of farmers around the world again. I'll come back to some of the political constraints at the end of my introduction here. The reports that are presented today are making important contributions to the public dialogue, I would say. So they document and they measure how our food systems have huge hidden cost. it's interesting to see that both of the reports are kind of converging on a number of which is more than 10 trillion US dollars. I mean, this is a huge amount. And of course, you know, models always have some, it depends a bit on assumptions and on the particular data that are being used. But the fact that these two very important exercises are converging around the same number, I think is a really important conclusion and finding and input to the global dialogue. They come from, these hidden costs come from several areas, and I think the presenters today will document these in more detail. But environmental costs are obviously a very important component. They're estimated by FSEC to be at over $3 trillion. I mean, I'm so used to speak about millions and billions, so the concept of trillion is way beyond that, $3 trillion US dollars per year. They come from global greenhouse gas emissions, nitrogen pollution of waterways and air, deforestation, etc. Then another huge component is health cost, okay? And there the FSEC report estimates these around almost close to 10 trillion by itself, okay? Also in the FAO report, these are very high. They come from the combination of diseases, non-communicable diseases, also obesity-related diseases, and also major impacts on labor productivity around the world again. The structural poverty also affects the cost of the system, and they come both from the fact that producers are not getting sufficient incomes from farming. I mean, many of the poorest people in the world are actually involved in producing food and agriculture. And at the same time, the high cost of food for consumers is contributing to poverty and to malnutrition there. Now, an important point to make, I think, in this debate is that we should not confuse the hidden cost of the food system with the cost, the investment cost or the policy costs that are needed to basically solve or to come up with solutions. I mean, these numbers are quite different and they're very different, so we should keep them separate. At IFPRI, we have worked on this for quite a bit to come up with investment cost. We are currently launching actually a new blog series on financing the transformation of the food system, where we will identify some of these investment costs that are needed, very broadly defined. And so an important point we have been working on with our colleagues at FAO, OECD and the World Bank is about repurposing the current public expenditures that are already there in terms of both on agricultural subsidies, broadly defined again, and more broadly on subsidies which are there to target consumers and welfare of the poorest. We have engaged in a number of suggestions of how this could happen, and so we should it's important to both look at this from the global perspective, the major changes that are needed in the globe, but also to turn it down to come back to the national, to country level initiative, country level policy changes. And there we work together with a number of agencies around the world again to basically support them in analysis and to come up with better, what's called now the nationally determined contribution and the national adaptation plan. And so we are working with countries around the world to help these countries design these plans and these strategies there. And so this is a combination of the type of investments that are needed, rearranging policies in a variety of areas that are all needed because it's a very broad area that we're looking at, not just in terms of investments in rural infrastructure, for example, changing incentives for farmers, but also I think consumer behavior and access to nutritious food is a really important component of that. So last week here at IFPRI we launched our annual Global Food Development Report, which was focused on healthy diets and nutrition in transforming food systems. And so I will refer to that for more details on that as well. So let me then end by pointing out just a short reflection on political economy. Transformations of this type are very difficult. So they require innovations in various ways. For example, we will need new technologies, no doubt about that. But new technologies is not enough. So we need change in behavior, change in policies. And there are often winners in this, there are often winners and losers in this, and that makes change very difficult. People are reluctant to change, particularly in certain environments, and the uncertainty is there today very much in the various different circumstances that people face around the world. And the shocks that we face today, they can both be a catalyst for change, but they also can increase the resistance to change. And I think that is part of what we're seeing today. I think we can make a contribution by identifying impacts and identifying the cost of not changing. Okay, and I think the reports that we will see here today, hear from, are exactly doing that. And I hope they can make a major contribution to the change that is needed going forward. So I just want to finish here by thanking everybody for being here today, our colleagues from FAO, from FSEC for contributing, and our colleagues from IFPRI also for contributing to the presentation and the discussion. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jo. It's now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Maximo Torero, who's the chief economist at the FAO, previously with the World Bank, and Maximo is also an alum of IFPRI, having served 10 years here as the director of our Markets, Trade and Institution Division. Maximo, it's really great to have you with us, and we look forward to your remarks.
No, thank you very much, and thank you very much to Jo and to IFPRI for hosting us in this joint event, and nice to see also the Food Systems Economics Commission part of this process. So it's a great pleasure for me to be with you today and to bring this topic, which is so important, which is addressing the hidden cost of our agri-food systems. This is a topic that has always been there in the background. There has been a lot of work on the topic, but with no consistency on definitions, no consistency on framework, which make it very difficult to come up and to understand the different numbers that were coming from different sources. So it became extremely close to my process of thinking and the work that we were doing at FAO. That's why we decided to put a lot of emphasis on it. And it's important because of, as Jo mentioned, we are facing a significant challenges in these days or years where we have numbers of chronic undernourishment, of food insecurity, acute food insecurity, numbers of nutritional indicators which are not going in the correct direction, and in many cases far away of the correct direction of what we put as targets in the SDG indicators for 6 years ahead from us. But also we are observing that the agri-food system, as we know, is interrelated with biodiversity loss, with health issues, with malnutrition, but also with climate and climate change. So we need to bring those interlinkages, and the lemma that we use for that is good food for all for today and tomorrow, where we refer a good food for all means access to healthy diets, and for today is what we can achieve as the right to food, but for tomorrow is to make it in such a way that becomes sustainable. Because it's an essential condition for realizing the 2030 agenda, given the interlinkages of the agri-food systems with other sectors, and given the importance of increasing resilience, inclusiveness, and efficient sustainability. Now, for me, there are 3 core elements that are brought in this process. The first one is that clearly we are not achieving what we need to achieve in terms of the transformation of the agri-food systems to achieve SDG 2 and at the same time to achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius. That balance of bringing them together is central because they are completely interrelated. And yes, it is true that SDG 2 will imply significant externalities, which we are trying to measure through the true cost accounting. But it's also true that it provides the right to food and the access to healthy diets. But it's also true that if we are careful on how we produce for the future, we won't be achieving the 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that will create a significant problem to us. So the second concept is, of course, how we do that, and that's the just transition mechanism, where we look at, on one side, increasing efficiencies, where the agri-food system has an enormous space for increasing efficiencies. This is minimizing these externalities, but also the capacity of rebalancing, which is central because we have certain parts of the world that are over-consuming certain goods, which are essential for other parts of the world, which are under-consuming that. And the third concept is the intertemporality. Normally, the ministers of finance forget the importance of the tomorrow, and the actions that we do today will have an impact on tomorrow. And we need to understand those effects tomorrow to be able to do actions today that will be aligned to minimize those externalities. And that's exactly the role of trying to have a photograph of and a better understanding of the true cost of food because it can guide us in reaching these goals by informing how to transform the agri-food system for better. If I want to do an agenda of repurposing and I don't know what is the true cost behind, then my agenda could be completely biased and not necessarily going to the correct way and providing the correct incentives to minimize those externalities. So it's vital that the impacts of our actions within these systems are made transparent and with a clear understanding of what is behind. So FAO tried to respond to this by dedicating 2 consecutive issues of the State of Food and Agriculture, the SOFA, for the first time since its publication in 1947, to uncover the true impacts of agri-food systems for informed decision-making. This is a very sensitive topic, and we took that challenge and we decided to move forward with many of our partners to try to do that. SOFA 2023 examined the hidden impact of our agri-food systems on the environment, health and livelihoods, so that agri-food system actors can make better informed decisions. And using true cost accounting, it quantified the hidden cost of our agri-food systems for 154 countries in a consistent and comparable way, which as our role of normative agency was central, so that we can come all with a common framework, and that's where we have been working also with the True Cost Accounting Coalition of the Food System Summit. And doing the analysis for so many countries also, of course, will bring challenges, and that's where we are trying to improve, and we're trying to bring solutions to those challenges. Like, for example, what happens when there is a country that most of its food is imported, then how we assign that accounting and those externalities, because they are not generated in the country where it was created. This, for example, in case of developed countries will be the case of Switzerland, but in the case of poor countries or developing countries could be the case of many SIDS and LLDC countries. Now, the figures that emerge from the FAO and FSEC reports are striking. We find with a very high degree of confidence that the agri-food system generate over 10 trillion in hidden costs in 2020. The absolute number is around 12 trillion, but with confidence, 10 trillion in hidden costs in 2020. This means it is in the range of 10% of the global GDP of costs associated with agri-food systems that go unaccounted. And there are 3 key findings that I think are important to share. First, dietary patterns that led to obesity and non-communicable diseases, which in turn cause productivity losses, are the most significant contributor to hidden cost of agri-food systems. And we are working today, I was just coming out of the Nutrition Week, where we are trying to come up with a new indicator for diversity of diets, which is related to access to healthy diets and to adoption and consumption of healthy diets. Because one thing is that I cannot access. I can access for some parts of the population. The other thing is that I don't adopt them and I don't really access them despite I have the resources. Now, these costs are particularly relevant for high and upper middle income countries, and they are also the reason why most hidden costs are generated in upper middle income and high income countries. And we are observing a significant change lately on the insurance companies also to try to minimize those, so that they are incorporating this intertemporal allocation that I was referring at the beginning. Institutions most involved in making decisions in agri-food systems are not well positioned to address this particular health challenge, and that's something that we need to work and transform. However, the perspective of where hidden costs are most challenging changes if we look at them relative to GDP, which is where market transactions are included. And this brings me to the second point, which is where are hidden costs the most challenging? And it is on low-income countries that the burden of these hidden costs to their GDP is highest. And they're equivalent to an average of 28% of GDP, mostly from impacts of poverty and undernourishment. Clearly, addressing poverty and undernourishment remains a priority for low-income countries, and that's the welfare effect as a consequence of these hidden costs. And finally, the third point is on environmental hidden costs, which constitute more than 20% of total quantified hidden costs, which should not be underestimated that they correspond nearly to 1/3 of the value added by agriculture that is causing them. These 3 findings indicate that the priority and entry points to address hidden costs needs to vary depending on geography and country average and income levels. Clearly, these hidden costs cannot be ignored, but they can be addressed. That's the question. And there is where we have the challenges, and there is when we need to understand this intertemporal issue. We need to understand that this not necessarily imply converting these externalities into a price, so increase the price of food. That's not the aim. The aim is to understand where they are occurring and what policies need to be implemented to be able to change this and provide the proper incentives. But we need also to understand that in some cases, it could imply that we need to remove some support or some subsidies that will end in an increase in prices. For example, managing the environmental, social, and health hidden cost of the agri-food system has direct implications for our path towards the better production, better nutrition, better environment, and better life for all. Governments, business, and financial institutions, as well as research and civil organizations, all have important roles to play on this path towards more sustainable agri-food systems. So for SOFA 2024, FAO is now in the process of developing targeted true cost case studies using country-specific data with input from local stakeholders linking hidden costs to actionable solutions. And this will be central because not only will allow us to keep improving the framework that we have implemented in the 2023, but also to have very concrete measures on what solutions can be put in place. In conclusion, we are finding that true cost accounting can help policy makers reflect on priorities, facilitate engagement, and identify effective actions. It is needed because addressing the hidden cost revealed in SOFA 2023 inherently requires addressing distributional issues entrenched in the global as well as local agri-food systems. And again, it brings the concept of just transition, which I think is essential. So thank you very much for this opportunity to share what we have been working. And it was a pleasure to be with you today. And sorry I couldn't be there in person. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maximo. And thanks to you and Yo for really setting out this topic very, very nicely and delineating the different types of hidden costs we're talking about in terms of lost productivity, the health costs, as well as the environmental costs. So now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the two reports. And first up is Andrea Cattaneo from the FAO, serving as a senior economist, and he has the task of actually leading the SOFA report each year, which is one of the FAO flagship reports. And he's going to give us the key findings of their report on revealing the true cost of food to transform agri-food systems. Thanks so much, Andrea.
It's a classic. So thank you, Charlotte, for the introduction. My thanks also to Yo and Maximo for introducing the topic, I think, in a very effective manner. And I can improvise without slides, if that's... I'm wondering if maybe, I don't know.
Maybe tell us about your next SOFA while we're getting this.
Yes, well, I was part of a discussion. But,
you have multiple. That one.
Excellent. So it's great to be back at IFPRI in person for what I think is a very interesting event, because it's a very appropriate concatenation of work that is being linked through this event, which goes a little bit beyond the individual reports. I think that's why I'm particularly happy to be here. So as Maximo mentioned, he gave a very good introduction on the fact that we're going to have, we had the SOFA 2023 focusing on revealing the true cost of food to transform agri-food systems. That was a report that was intended to raise awareness. And we'll see a little bit about what came out of that report. But also we're currently working on the 2024 report on the same kind of general theme, but in a nutshell, the SOFA 2024 will focus more on how to address these hidden costs and focus more on kind of case studies. So just very rapidly, since this whole event is on hidden costs. However, I think we need to be clear that the value of agri-food systems is not in doubt. We're not focusing on that today. We're not thinking about, should we have agri-food systems or not? We are thinking about, okay, how can we have agri-food systems deliver more value? And this is important. It links to the political economy issues that you mentioned, because how this message is received depends very much on the stakeholders you're engaging and how that message comes through. And so the side of the benefits does matter, and it comes through food, clearly, but it also comes through jobs, through culture, and we have to be conscious of that. But I think it's very clear that agri-food systems generate significant hidden costs that impact environment, society, and health, and are really highly relevant for all countries, which is something we didn't really expect coming into this, right? And we'll get a little bit to that in terms of the results. Now, these costs are hidden because they're not included in the market prices, which market prices, I mean, they shape the incentives to produce, to process, to distribute, and to consume. And that's why these matter, right? So they're hidden in the sense that they're not really considered in the day-to-day decisions of agri-food actors. So it is really essential that these hidden costs are assessed and valued through rigorous accounting. So that's where true cost accounting, known as TCA, is kind of brought into the picture because it is a systemic approach to measure and value kind of the environmental, social, health, and economic costs and benefits generated by agri-food systems. And the objective is to improve decision-making. So it's not, the objective is not counting these costs, but it's how do we use them to then improve decision-making and improve the value of agri-food systems. So I think both Jo and Maximo touched on this, so I'll very rapidly, this was a very kind of preliminary quantification of hidden costs for 154 countries using global data sets. The value, the expected value is in the range of 12.7 trillion, and it's divided in environmental, social, and health costs. So the environmental hidden costs include greenhouse gas emissions, nitrogen emissions, impact of land use change, and water use, and amount to approximately 3 trillion in 2020 purchasing power parity dollars. So, and this corresponds to about 20% of total quantified hidden costs. And these are likely underestimated because there are elements of environmental impacts that are not captured because there was no global database to capture them. So this is why we refer to these estimates as preliminary. And then individual countries may decide to delve deeper for some of these hidden costs. Now, as I think both Jo and Maximo mentioned, there is uncertainty around these numbers, right? There are assumptions, there are distributions of probabilities, and so it's like, how sure are we that the cost is this high? Well, modeling the uncertainty for all of these subcomponents, it comes out that we are pretty sure that this is 10 trillion or higher. And so it gets to the point that, well, okay, this is in the range of 10% of GDP, as Maximo was pointing out. So it's a big issue for economies overall, right? Now, we also have the breakdown in the environmental dimension, as I mentioned, where nitrogen plays an important role. This is through nitrogen emissions in water and in the air, and that is the other kind of breakdown there, followed by land use change. Whereas the social hidden costs are associated with poverty experienced by people working in agri-food systems, so producers, but also along the supply chain, and undernutrition more broadly. And the kind of poverty of people working within agri-food systems is the lion's share of this social cost, which is low relative to the health costs, which play the lion's share at over 70% of these global hidden costs. So, you know, moving on, right, in terms of the, you know, aggregating the hidden costs at the global level hides important variation across the income levels of countries that are kind of key decision makers in reducing these costs. I mean, policymakers, but also the main stakeholders within countries. And so looking at it by country income categories, we see this figure on the left, it breaks down the total quantified hidden costs, right, by these main categories by country income group. And the first observation is that most of the hidden costs are generated in upper middle income and high income countries, while low income countries really make up a small share of that, about 3%. And except for low income countries, productivity losses from dietary patterns really dominate, followed by environmental costs. Where the productivity losses from dietary patterns are basically days of labor lost estimated at the kind of average wage for countries, which has implications for how big those health costs are, because wages vary pretty substantially, even in purchasing power parity terms. However, the perspective of where hidden costs are more challenging changes if we look at them relative to GDP. Maximo touched upon that. And that's because, you know, GDP matters because it's where market transactions are included. It's kind of the side of the economy that we know. So comparing costs to GDP gives a sense of the burden of these hidden costs that they place on national economies, and it provides an indication as to where to prioritize resources to address these costs. So as a share of GDP, costs are relatively much higher in low-income countries at an average of 27%, in large part driven by poverty in agri-food systems and undernourishment. So the narrative really does change quite dramatically when looking at the issues relative to the average income earned. So it highlights that even though globally the social costs, when you look at dollar terms, are really the smallest of the hidden costs, they are likely the priority in many low-income and lower middle-income countries. And this was a result that we weren't really expecting, that there would be this much higher burden on low-income countries. It kind of confirms the narrative that these things matter, but it's interesting that an approach that we thought would kind of be more focusing on the issues of higher income countries was indeed more relevant, even more relevant for low-income countries. So now this is, and here I kind of transition into, you know, what are we going to do with, give a sneak preview about SOFA 2024. So first of all, the national level estimates that we have presented, as I mentioned, they're preliminary, and they serve a purpose of awareness building. Now, the SOFA 2024 report will continue working on these estimates, and one particular area where we're working is decomposing these dietary risks into subgroups, because we saw it's a very big part of the health costs, and we are so it's interesting to find, you know, what entry points depending on the risks associated with diets. So overall, we're looking at kind of adapting to assessment needs, kind of covering specific agri-food systems. One can change the scope or look at supply chains or the consumer side and doing more targeted assessments. It also kind of targeted assessments allow us to explore scenarios, and this is something that we'll see, I think, on the FSEC presentation, where they went deeper into this aspect. And in doing so, we can identify kind of trade-offs and synergies. And finally, it's kind of assessing levers for system transformation means assessing the entry points, right? These can be along kind of agri-food supply chains. They can be linked to agri-food supply chains. One can think about different levers, it's subsidies, it's trade policies, it's laws, regulation for stakeholders along the system. But then also consumers, again, they respond to subsidies, to taxes, but also leveraging their purchasing power, marketing and promotion, labeling, certification, all entry levers that we don't usually think about, but that we need to think about if we're trying to address kind of these health costs. And also general services in terms of infrastructure and R&D, inspection services. So, governments, businesses, and financial institutions, as well as research and civil society organizations, all have important roles to play on this path towards kind of more sustainable agri-food systems. Now, finding that right combination of better policies and investments in more sustainable agri-food systems can reduce these hidden costs, right? But keeping in mind that distributional issues that Maximo touched upon, for example, will require really consultation and stakeholder engagement. I think this is something that's coming out of SOVA 2024, that distributional issues, stakeholder engagement, if you want to do, TCA can be an avenue for that and kind of thinking through what we need to change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for outlining the report. And we look forward to the 2024 SOVA on this topic as well. So we're going to shift now to the other report, with this, which is the Food Systems Economic Commission report. And it's my pleasure to introduce Katarina Ruggeri-Laderchi. She is the director of FSEC and has really done an amazing job of pulling all of this work together. So the floor is yours.
So thank you so much, Charlotte, and thank you, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here and share with you the results of the FSEC Global Policy Report. So just to get us started, let me introduce you a little bit. This is our overall commission. So you've seen already Johan and Maximo. We will have Jess joining us as well. But I just wanted to give you a sense that there is a big group of international experts on food systems, development, and sustainability, which is behind this report. And the Commission has actually been working for almost 4 years and has done a really comprehensive set of, really large research program. And I would actually suggest that you look on our website because all the information, all the background information is there. But, we've been able to distill all the thinking of these wonderful people and this massive research program in very much one sentence, which is that transforming food systems is necessary, is possible, it's hugely beneficial, and it is not easy. And fortunately, Danielle will walk us through the difficulties, so I don't need to talk about that. So I'll just go quickly through the rest of our message. So first of all, the transforming food system is necessary. When you joined the meeting, when you walked into the room, you might have seen there was this really big number. That is the hidden cost calculator from the FSEC website, which tells you what are the hidden costs that have accumulated from the signing of the Paris Agreement. So had we decided to take action in 2016, those could most probably have been significantly reduced. And then you've heard from Andrea and from Maximo about the over $10 trillion of hidden costs that food systems create each year. And we decided to move our emphasis. Our analysis is very global, unlike the one of FAO, which is what makes these two reports very complementary. But we tried to look at the future, what happens next. So the first thing we did is we looked at current trends. And we've also been quite optimistic in our assumptions. So we have assumed that countries would actually stick to all the policy commitments they have already made. And we tried to say, where would we end up in 2050 if we stick with the current patterns? And we end up in a rather bad place. We're still on a pathway of 2.7 degrees by the end of the century. Food systems continue contributing about 1/3 of greenhouse gases emissions. 640 million people remain undernourished. While there is a big spike in obesity, something like 10% of the population in 2050 would be estimated to be obese. So this is definitely not where we want to end up. So what can we do? We try to think on what a transformation would look like, and we kind of focus on these 5 operational goals, which in a way are pretty uncontroversial. There's a consensus on what needs to happen in food systems. And when I say non-controversial, I really mean globally. Those are big priorities, but we know there is a lot of debate on what change needs to look like in every context. And this is really important to us to say that this is a global direction. We think there is a lot of space for the kind of local stakeholder engagement that Andrea mentioned to figure out what these priorities look like in different contexts. And what you're really talking about is ensuring access to a healthy diet for all, ensuring strong livelihoods for those who work in food systems, producing in an environmental sustainable way, protecting natural resources, and restoring, as possible, degraded land. And all these things together will actually contribute to make a food systems which is both less exposed to shocks, but also better able to face those shocks. And the way we proceeded is basically to focus on these kind of 5 high-level objectives, work out what are a set of measures that can be modeled for each of those, and then look at an alternative pathways of food system transformation, looking particularly at the synergies and trade-offs. And you will find there is lots of similarities in our findings with other themes that have already been discussed. And the good news is that we find that it is still possible, even now, to transform food systems in ways which are compatible with reaching these objectives. And this is, I think, a really important message. And, I've selected just one of the many results from our modeling, which shows that by 2040, we could already transform food systems to become net sink, so to actually contribute to absorbing emissions, as opposed to contributing to the problem. And this would be possible while at the same time eliminating undernutrition by 2050, by protecting 1.2 billion hectares of land, restoring 200 million, reforesting 200 million hectares of land. So a lot of good things can happen, but I'd really like to draw attention to the fact that we can see that there are also some trade-offs. And in particular, we can come back to this later on the issues of prices, but it is very likely there will be pressures of food prices emerging, and they're not everywhere the same, and they will vary over the process of transformation, but there is clearly a big distributional effect there. And the other thing is, in our transformation, what we think of as a typical development process where workers leave agriculture to move to better jobs would actually intensify. So there is a lot of upheaval happening in this transition, and we're talking about a big and systemic change. And so how we manage these trade-offs is a really important part, and I think Danielle will also help us think about that. The Commission then puts forward a set of 5 entry points for change. And again, these are kind of global priorities. You will see they're very aligned with a lot of the things which have already been discussed. And they could form the starting point for these local processes of trying to think what food system transformation looks like locally. So first big priority, shifting consumption patterns towards healthy diets. Jess will tell us more about this, but that is really central to the process of the transformation. A big role of changing incentives, so both the positive and negative incentives that we have now, so repurposing government support for agriculture, we've already mentioned it, that is very important, particularly in high-income countries. But as we're looking at the future, we also need to think of countries that are developing now and trying to make sure that they will not follow the same patterns that high-income countries have already followed. There is an issue also of setting new negative incentives. For example, the report talks about the possibility of introducing a tax on nitrogen, which is such a, we've seen as such a big component of the hidden costs, and we start having also the technology for monitoring these things at the farm level. So thinking of introducing new incentives, which is both important in itself, but it's also important to mobilize resources for the transformation. And this is because a big part of this agenda is really, it has to do with innovation. And it has to do with what Maximo called the just transition, but it's really ensuring that no one is left behind, which means both managing the whole issue of safety nets, what to do when there are if these food price pressures emerge, but it's also about helping farmers adapt to new ways of producing, to an environment which could be much more risky as we move forward. So this, even if I'm just giving you like the tip of the iceberg of what are the things that one could start by doing, is already a really daunting agenda. And the good news is that the payoffs of following this agenda are actually massive. And central to what the Commission was doing was trying to estimate the net benefits of transforming food systems between now and 2050, and we've done that with with 2 different methodologies. And again, as I think Yo mentioned about the analysis of the hidden costs, when you do things in 2 different ways and you end up in a very similar place, it kind of gives you lots of confidence. And we can say that there are at least 5 trillion a year of benefits in terms of reduced hidden costs that could accrue from this transformation. 2 important things there. One is like the hidden costs will not go to 0, actually, and this is very much a legacy of the health hidden costs. There is a part of what we've already been very ambitious in what we have modeled in terms of what would happen to obesity, which is basically stabilizing the numbers to the current levels. And some people think that that's already very ambitious. There was a lot of debate on this in the Commission. And the costs of these health costs are basically baked in the system, and they will remain high also past 2050. At the same time, really in terms of these are net benefits, but if you think of what is the investment required, it is high, but it's globally affordable. We are looking at a ballpark between $200 and $500 billion a year, which is, of course, which globally we could, if this is the type of payoff that we're talking about, is something could be a communal effort. Is also very unevenly distributed, so to say it would not be affordable for low-income countries, which then raises a lot of the issues that Yo pointed to at the beginning. There is a big international governance element of this, and how are we going to manage this transition? I think I can leave you with a message of hope. This would be really worthwhile doing. And then I will let Jess telling you about one of the major levers for making that happen, which is changing diets. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katerina. Those are quite some numbers that we need to be thinking about, and we'll dig into those during the Q&A. So many thanks to Jessica Fanzo for joining us online today. Jessica was a commissioner, or is still a commissioner of FSEC. She is also the professor of climate and food and the director for the Food for Humanity initiative at the Columbia Climate School and Columbia University. And as already announced, you're going to take a deeper look at the implications on diets and the hidden costs that we see impacting diets, and then the impact that has on health and other outcomes. Over to you, Jessica. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much to IFPRI, FSEC, FAO for hosting this. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. New York City stopped me from coming. So let's dig into diets and this idea that shifting diets alone could deliver 70% of the economic benefits in transforming food systems. Well, how is that even possible? Well, when we think about diets, what people eat, it represents a powerful confluence where consumer choice can have a profound impact on not only themselves, but on a whole society approach. Next slide, please. To really understand how this works, we need to start by understanding what a healthy diet is and how far we are from achieving healthy diets for everyone. I think many of you know there's specific foods that make up a healthy diet. Those principles and the foods that make up that healthy diet are not that complicated. What is complicated is how people can access those healthy diets. Healthy diets are made up of macronutrients, micronutrients, bioactive components, many of them being healthy that we're just starting to understand. And these are all delivered through healthy foods, fruits, vegetables, legumes, animal source foods, dairy. And this constitutes what are called diverse and healthy diets that are in line with culture and tradition. We also know that limiting unhealthy ingredients like additive sugars, sodium, artificial ingredients, it can be quite harmful to health. So when we think about diets, we're a long way from that currently. Most people don't eat what is considered a healthy diet. They can't get access to those diets, whether it's economically, physically, or socially. And what we're dealing with then is this massive burden of malnutrition, and diets and food, along with other factors outside of the food system, are contributing to that malnutrition burden. If you go to slide 3, and as the FSEC showed, diets are critically important. The health costs are estimated to contribute $11 trillion per year of the $15 trillion of the hidden costs in the food system. And largely that's due to the effects of labor productivity. Much of this is due to diet-related non-communicable diseases, resulting in cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, that claims 8 million lives annually and 13% of the global disability-adjusted life years. And the health costs also include, in a lower bound figure, undernutrition and the productivity costs of that. So eating a healthy diet is one of the single most impactful ways to control these risks and help avoid long-term illness. Next slide. So the FSEC modeling is an interesting approach to look at this. And this is just a diagram showing you a model, a sketch, a wire diagram of how the model looked at diets and health. Now, it's assuming that everyone around the world adopts the Eat Lancet Commission diet. Now, that's a big assumption. We can talk about that in the Q&A. And FSEC modeled that everyone takes on this diet by 2050. That means increased consumption of fruits and veg and legumes in several regions. It means reducing animal source foods in some areas and in some regions. And this could have profound health effects. If you click again, you'll see the savings there. The idea is that this could save 174 million lives by 2050. But it's not just human health impacts. If we shift diets, we could change the environmental impacts and climate change impacts. So for example, on the right side of the graph, a reduction in meat consumption in certain region can lead to the number of livestock needed. That reduces the demand for feed and fodder. It results in reduced pasture and cropland use, less water use, an increase in forested areas, less extensification into these forestscapes that are important for biodiversity and greenhouse gas sequestration. Can lower greenhouse gas emissions, particularly methane coming from livestock, a toxic short-lived greenhouse gas, and can reduce the speed and severity of climate change. So dietary change, whether it's through human health or environment, can be an important, powerful lever. Next slide. That's just the 174 million lives. Next slide, please. So just quickly, Katerina had showed a few examples of the FSEC modeling. And just to show you a bit more, when we look at what's called the current trends in orange versus the food system transformation that the FSEC modeled in green, you can see that we could have significant reductions in premature mortality and significant reductions in obesity prevalence if we were to make this shift in food systems. Next slide. When we look specifically at food, much of that has to come from shifting diets. And again, the orange is showing current trends for livestock product intake and current trends for fruits, legumes, nuts, and vegetables. And you can see that we need significant increases in those healthy foods, those plant-based foods, and we need reductions in livestock. And now, of course, certain countries, certain regions, particularly high-income countries, need to significantly drive down their animal source foods. They consume way more than they need for human health and meeting nutrient requirements. But there will be some middle-income countries and some low-income countries that will also need to reduce their animal source foods. with some low-income regions and countries coming up on their animal source foods to meet their nutrient needs. So there's a real finesse and nuance to who needs to increase, who needs to decrease, and what kinds of foods. Next slide, please. And this is, I really love this slide. And the next 3 slides are really just showing you the power of diets. When we look at the potential food system transformation and driving down those hidden costs compared to current trends, look at the blue. That's the dietary intake changes. So by 2050, diets can really be a powerful lever in driving down those hidden costs, a 70% reduction. And it's not, again, just thinking about the costs for human health. It's also cost to the environment, reallocation of land, enabling countries to invest in forest protection and reforestation, and the social benefits for climate change mitigation and adaptation. Next slide. And we have to think about what are the bundles, what are the kind of combinations of things. While diets, as you can see from that bar graph, the kind of policy levers to shift diets are important. It's the combined net impact that will really drive down those costs. And next slide. And it's not just cost that we care about. This is work independent from the FSEC, from Michael Clark and David Tillman, showing that if we combine our interventions, not just on ag production, shown at the left side, not just consumption, not just reducing food loss and waste, that last bar shows you need a combined implementation of multiple policy bundles if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius, the Paris climate target. So it's not just benefits to ending the costs of what the food system is contributing to the economy, but really for climate change mitigation and adaptation. I have just one last slide. If we flick through, changing diets is critical, but it's really challenging. Many people are suffering from the inability to access healthy diets. So we need to help eaters, consumers. We can't just put the responsibility on them. Governments, private sector need to help. Next slide. So how do we shift? Next slide, sorry. It might have been easier if I did this myself. And as Katerina had talked about, we need incentives, innovation, and investment. Incentives of consuming and accessing healthy diets need to come from taxes on unhealthy foods, subsidizing healthy foods, redeploying the agriculture subsidies away from foods that cause harm to health and the environment, regulating advertising and marketing, particularly to young children and teenagers, leveraging public procurement to shift demand through schools, hospitals, prisons, and using front-of-the-pack labeling. Innovation can come from reformulating foods, biofortification, new alt protein food products. And we need investment, more infrastructure towards food system innovation and sustainability.
Jessica,
and
thanks for wrapping up when you can, please.
Yeah, and then my last slide, my last one is dietary change is essential. It can really unlock the benefits for food system transformation. Thank you all so much, and I'm sorry I went a minute over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. We have one more speaker, and then we'll be opening up for Q&A. So for those of you online, please continue to submit your questions on ifpri.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or using the hashtag AskIFPRI on X. So our final speaker, last but not least, is Danielle Resnick. She's a senior research fellow in the Development Strategies and Governance Unit here at IFPRI. And along with Yo, she recently co-edited a book, which was just released last September, on the political economy of food systems transformation, pathways to progress in a polarized world, published by Oxford University Press. And Danielle is going to get into some of the difficult political economy questions around this very big topic. So over to you, Danielle.
Okay, thanks, Charlotte. And I think many of the speakers have already alluded to the fact that this is a necessary transformation, but it's certainly not easy. And Yo had already discussed a little bit some of the political economy dimensions that we need to take into account. The FSEC report, I think, really needs to be congratulated because I think it's the first time I've seen an entire chapter, chapter 5 of this report, focuses on the political economy. Typically, this is just subsumed in 1 or 2 paragraphs at the end of a report. I'm not going to be able to go into all the details and nuance that's in the report, but I will just touch on a few points, considerations on the political economy issues that's really drawing both on what the report's saying, but also what we've learned from both the politics of climate policy reform and also the politics of multi-sectoral nutrition policy reform. So one of the kind of first considerations that we know from those different experiences is the importance of policy design, being savvy about how we design policies in a way that we galvanize and we bring along with us reform proponents. And you typically do this best by concentrating benefits and diffusing costs. So the Inflation Reduction Act here in the US, some consider that to really do this in terms of concentrating benefits among corporations and households and diffusing the costs among and across taxpayers more broadly. By contrast, if you're going to concentrate costs and diffuse the benefits, you're more likely to, really mobilize the opponents who will be able to see that they've kind of been targeted and feel more likely to engage in some type of collective action against reform. So one example of this is some of the farmer protests that we've been seeing recently, particularly where farmers feel that they're bearing the burden or disproportionate costs in terms of dealing particularly with the climate crisis. So the graph on the right is taking data from the ACLED database, mapping farmer protests over the last decade. So you can see actually farmer protests have grown quite significantly over time. And the dashed line is actually highlighting that is a share of total protests. Just as of 2024, we're only 6 months into the year, they constitute 10% of global protests. Now, the green bars are highlighting those farmer protests where the farmers are pushing back against climate policy provisions. So about half of our farmer protests are particularly in that category. But a majority, almost 98%, are in the European Union, right? So the other half of protests, farmers are wanting government assistance with climate change. They're wanting support with dealing with droughts, with dealing with flooding. So the takeaway here is that in places where farmers feel they're bearing the costs, they're more likely to push back. Now, one way to deal with this is particularly to show the benefits of concentrating benefits. And one way of doing this is to earmark transfers. This makes the hidden benefits more visible. And the FSEC report gives some good examples of that. One, I think, is in Bolivia, where they taxed hydrocarbon and earmarked it for investment in school feeding programs. And that's a really nice example also of issue linkage, where you're tying different issues together to broaden your reform constituencies. Other ways of doing this, as we've seen, when you tie climate and national security together, or climate and jobs, you typically have broadened reform coalitions. A second consideration is always timing, and Maximo was talking about different temporal elements of this transformation process. We know more broadly, no matter what kind of policy you're talking about, honeymoon periods, when a political administration first gets into office, particularly if they have a large majority, a clear mandate, this is often the most propitious time for engaging in difficult reforms. But also thinking about sequencing. We've heard a lot about policy bundling to get to this transformation agenda, but But you can't do all of this at once. There has to be some sequencing in this process. In some ways, we really need to think about how we secure the financing before we're thinking about, who are we targeting with social protection, or which types of further investments we're making in rural infrastructure or ag R&D. And there's political economy dynamics at each point in that sequencing. If you're repurposing subsidies to secure financing, that has a set of political economy dynamics separate from who are you targeting for social protection support, or which commodities are you going to target for ag R&D support. And this also points to the importance of policy feedback loops. We know if we're talking about bundling, you can have both vicious and virtuous cycles when you're sequencing, right? So if you do something poorly on your first step of reform, it's going to really undermine public confidence. And so what we found, in a lot of work in this space, particularly in the climate politics space, is thinking about how you provide benefits first. Maybe it's tax rebates, maybe it's certain subsidies to generate buy-in for adoption of potentially more costly policies later. So you're really kind of bringing people along with your agenda. If you think of, companies that have invested in green technology or renewable energy, they've sunk their costs in this new trajectory and are less likely to want to change course. And this also really aligns with what we know from behavioral economics, and particularly from prospect theory, which is that typically as humans, we're much less likely to accept potential losses, even in the face of greater 5 to 10 trillion greater potential gains, but gains that are uncertain, right? Because there's a lot of dots that need to be connected before we get to that 5 to 10 trillion by 2040 or 2050. So by thinking about ways you front load the benefits to reform, that's a way to also deal with, our individual aversion to losses. Thirdly, thinking about institutions and champions. Policies, don't occur in a vacuum. They're often shaped by the institutional context in which policymakers are operating. Some of the more difficult policy reforms can be more feasible where you have political institutions that can better insulate policymakers from public backlash. We know a lot of democracies don't have some of that insulation, and as Yo alluded to, we're in a year of many different elections, a lot of electoral turnover, and so even though we have a long-term kind of food systems agenda, we're living in a period of a lot of short-term political uncertainty and turnover. And what we know from the multi-sectoral nutrition experience is really dealing with this turnover and generating momentum and commitment over the long term really requires finding your champions and finding multiple champions, multiple scales, going beyond just dealing with cabinet ministries and executives, engaging with legislators who typically provide budget oversight, engaging with bureaucrats who are staying in the administration longer, and even public personalities that may have more credibility with the communities that you're trying to mobilize. Lastly is thinking about coordination. There's many dimensions to coordination. We could be talking about public-private partnerships. I'm just talking here about public sector coordination, thinking through this challenge that we have in this space that very few countries have food system ministries. So how do you get the kind of coordination you need for this very complex bundled agenda for food systems reforms? There's 3 common approaches to doing this. One is a sectoral body, sectoral ministry with technical expertise leading the way. And that's what most countries do. We even saw from the submissions to the UN Food Systems Summit, it was the Ministry of Agriculture in 101 countries that continued to lead this very multifaceted agenda. A second approach is having a planning or finance ministry lead the way because they have that kind of 360-degree view of the budget process. And thirdly, an executive office, prime minister or president's office, leading the way because they have the political authority to get ministries to work together. We obviously can think through what are some of the challenges to coordination. Obviously, this isn't easy, and there's many reasons for that. But there's also some lessons, again, from the kind of nutrition space about what makes multi-sectoral coordination work. This is about having clear goal setting at the outset, delineating authority and accountability, who's responsible for what, and coming up with maybe new ways of budget management. We typically have very program-lined or sectoral-lined budget management that's not really conducive for this more integrated food systems agenda. So again, as I said at the outset, no way to touch on all the detailed points that the FSEC report nicely highlights in its chapter on political economy. I will just say, and I think Yo mentioned this at the outset as well, one of our challenges is we're often talking about this at the global level, but we're affected by really the absence of global governance mechanisms for food systems. Who's leading the way on this, kind of at the multilateral level? Of course, geopolitical rivalries and different power imbalances are affecting this challenge as well. There are some pockets of progress, and we saw some interesting developments in April, I think, with the Multilateral Development Bank discussions. Secondly, just to reiterate, we're dealing with actually multiple political economy dynamics simultaneously. We're dealing with global, we're dealing with the global to the domestic, and even sometimes at the regional level as well, as you think about some of the regional initiatives that are trying to tackle food systems, like in the African Union. And then I think finally, I was really encouraged by what Andrea is saying for this year's SOFA going forward, is thinking about some case studies and really getting away from the theoretical about who are winners and losers and costs and benefits, but we really need to get to some concrete case studies and really mapping out how these policy instruments, how they will be perceived by different stakeholders. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danielle. I'm going to invite our panel to take the seats up here. And as you come up here, anybody in the room who would like to ask a question, there are mics, and I will also get to the questions that have come in online. I think Yo and Danielle, go ahead and sit up there as well. I'll join you in a second. So I'm going to kick off with a question for Yo. I think you said in the beginning, this is an anonymous questioner, and I'm sort of adding to it a little bit. You said in the beginning that everybody who's in the room and with us online believes this story about the hidden costs, right? We don't need to convince probably the people that are here, but are there people who don't agree? And then the question that's come in is in particular about farmers who feel targeted by some of these transformation measures. And could you talk a little bit more about that? Are we perhaps not talking enough about the benefits of the food systems, and because the farmers put so much of their work into producing food? How can we make food system transformation be less politicized and acceptable to players across the supply chain? And I was also struck by, I forget which one of the two reports, but somebody's recommending a tax on nitrogen, which is a key ingredient, obviously, for farmers. So is that tax intended to be paid by the farmers or by the industry? Just opine a little bit more about how we can deal with farmers who do feel very challenged by this. And I think maybe Danielle can jump in as well. Do we have success stories where farmers have embraced some of these agenda items, and how was that accomplished?
That didn't sound like a question. That sounded like a whole list of things to address. So let me start with the beginning, which I still what I said, or what I meant to say, is that I think the people who are with us today, either in the room, think that this issue is an important issue. I think that's really the point I wanted to make. I'm sure on the issue of hidden costs there's been quite a bit of discussions how to measure this properly, and the methodologies that you can use, the data that you need to use, and so I'm sure there is some continued discussion on this. But I think the power of what we have here today, and particularly the reports which are out there now, which are presented today, is that two important groups, I would say, or institutions which have come out with kind of independently done analysis, come to an estimate which is very much aligned, I would say. And I really liked the FAO approach there of putting these reliability constraints or probability thing around it in terms of this is where we're confident about. I think that's great. And so I think that's very strong. On the issue of, we are very much focusing on the farmer opposition to food system transformation, okay? But there is opposition throughout the entire food system, or there are concerns and reactions to it. And so, for example, I think the numbers that Jess projected or showed were very impressive, and a lot of the changes that are needed to take place to address these health costs are not at the farmer's level. It's actually further down the value chain, I would say, in the food systems, okay? And so there's also many changes that need to take place, and there is maybe not so much opposition in terms of demonstration by tractors under the Eiffel Tower or the Atomium in Brussels, but they are by not basically shifting for a number of reasons. I think to some extent, what Jess pointed out is that some people cannot change because of the circumstance they face, the budget that they have, etc. But there's also a number of things where people can change if they want, and they just don't do it because of a number of reasons. I think on the farmers' side, there is, you know, I mean, Danielle also mentioned, I mean, I really liked her graphs. I hadn't seen her before. I mean, so much is concentrated on Europe now. And I think to some extent, it's an existential question there, because the changes that are required, they should have been introduced decades ago, okay? And so now finally there's a very good Green Deal, I think, in Europe. The implementation of that is really forcing big changes on people in a relatively short time. And some of them are really constrained. And that basically it relates also, this is the point that OECD has this really nice report by Koen de Koning, is one of the authors, on values, what's called interest values, and what's the third one? Yes, ideas. So it's really, it's not only about the concept or the interest, how people are affected in terms of budget, etc., but also it's really about their livelihoods and basically the value of how they operate. And once you touch that, it becomes much more complicated. So I think it's a lot on that. And also, I mean, on the demonstration in Europe in particularly, if you look at, there's been demonstrations from the south to the north, but the issues which is really triggering them is actually quite different in each of these things. And so I think we have to be careful about that. And then the issue of polarization, we addressed that in our book with Danielle. She didn't mention it a lot now, but I think it's really important that it fits into this polarizing landscape. And of course, at election time, these things are really exploited as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Danielle, do you want to come in briefly, or you're good? Okay, so let's move to in the room. Please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Is it good? Can you hear me if I stand up straight? Awesome. So, Andrea, you spoke very truly at the beginning when you spoke of the complementarity of these two studies. And when you see them presented side by side like that, something really jumps out, right? I mean, both studies show that the bulk of the hidden trillions is coming from health costs associated with diets. And they're so large that they kind of dwarf the social costs, which are not small. We're still talking trillions. And the bulk of the social issues, I mean, all issues affect all income levels, which was a great graph in Andrea's presentation, the FAO presentation. But we see that the relative incidence of the poverty side falls in low-income countries. Then when we shift to the FSEC presentation, there's sort of a list of priorities, the first of which is a shift in diets, which of course affects everybody, but it's of great importance to high-income countries. And Jess, you have this wonderful graph where you show if we shift diets, here's the impact on the other costs. And you assign the color orange to poverty, and you can't even see it. Although I have kind of bad vision, but still, you could hardly, no, I couldn't see it, right? So I wonder if the panel wanted to unpack a little bit what that list of policy priorities might be from the low-income country perspective.
Great. I see Maximo is with us, and Jessica Fanzo is still also with us. So maybe, Maximo, you would like to take that last question. And if I can add a few more. We've had a lot of questions that have come in on the health side of things. And maybe we'll ask you this question as well, Maximo. Are the recommendations for governments like a meat tax realistic, considering that even the most progressive countries are unable to achieve them? Although noting that some countries in Latin America have actually been able to put in a tax on sugar sweetened beverages. But maybe you'd like to take that question, Maximo?
Sure. Let's start with the last part of the question, and then I move into Lorraine's question. I think when we refer to taxes or any of these type of fiscal instruments, we need to be very careful, and we need to look case by case, what are the potential effects of those tax policies. Why? Because in some countries, like in the case of Mexico, for example, where you can identify the level of sugar in each commodity, then it's easy to tax, because then you have the information to be able to do it properly and to measure the impacts. But there are other countries where the system is not so simple and could create some distortions that you don't want to have in place, especially when you have countries which are key producers of sugar. So I think in every country, we need to look carefully on how we apply. Of course, the idea of reducing the consumption of goods that could create a negative impact over health are important, but we need to look at it carefully case by case. In the case of the meat issues, again, we refer here at terrestrial animals, and the analysis that we're doing is just farther than just meat. It's looking at all the different types of consumption of terrestrial animals, but also looking at all the different positive effects and the potential effects over negative effects over NCDs. So again, I think it's really important to look at it carefully, and it's a sector where clearly the concept of redistribution is essential. Because as I said at the beginning, you have overconsumption in many of the developed countries, which has a significant effect over health. So if you take into account the impact over health, of course, it's clear for governments that that needs to change. And that's exactly what the insurance companies and the reinsurance companies are starting to do on the health sector. But then on the other hand, you have countries which are under consuming. And then you have to also relate that also to the emissions and the methane emissions that come from this type of products, where we need to look at it carefully and how we can gain efficiencies and efficiencies of the whole value chain. So when we look at the efficiencies in the case of production of meat, we need to look at all the value chain from the feed to also the disposal of what comes out of the production of livestock. And that is what will allow us to have efficient production, which not necessarily needs to be located in the south, but will allow the south to have more access to this type of enzymes and proteins, which seems to be important. Now, on the question of Lorraine, look, for me, when we were doing this analysis, the slide where you have the absolute levels, of course, and then you see the impacts on developed countries versus the slide where you look at the control by GDP, then you see also that in the case of the poorest countries, we have a big issue. Of course, the major issue in the poor countries is linked to labor and social issues and wages, and how we can minimize those externalities which are related to poverty. And that's where we need to have actions which are specifically targeted to that. One of the things that are extremely relevant right now is to try to interlink the three dimensions, because on one side, you want to increase incomes because you want to reduce poverty so that people can have more capacity of affordability of healthy diets. So you need to create actions that will be directed to increasing of value added and increasing of productivity and efficiency so that you can have better wages. On the second hand, you also need to be careful that you have the diversity of supply that you need. And that is where there is a significant gap in data in terms of the demand and the supply of the diversity of commodities that are required to have access to healthy diets. We are working a lot in trying to improve the information on the demand side. We know better the supply side, incorporating trade, of course, but still we need a lot more information on the demand side to be able to understand where are the gaps and what needs to be done to be able to make these diets more affordable. Why? Because the consumption of healthy diets will not only improve the health and the undernutrition and the overnutrition, because in Africa and in many of the poorest countries, you have the double burden of having both undernourishment and overnourishment. But also in the simulations that we have done in the previous office, we know that it's also improving in terms of environmental effects. So it's less negative in terms of emissions like monocommodities or monoculture. And the third element is what this means in terms of financing. And here is, for example, where the repurposing is a little bit complex, because repurposing could have an impact on the supply side in the case of developed countries because of the magnitudes. And in many cases, part of that is already in the process. But in the case of poor countries, the level of amount of resources for repurposing are extremely limited. And therefore, the impacts, if we do measures repurposing at the supply side, could be minimal, while the impacts could be higher on the demand side. And that's what was shown in the SOFI 2022, if I'm not wrong, or 2023. And why that is important? Because it could mean that we better target through the demand side, through social protection programs, ways in which we can improve this type of consumption that will allow then a supply response. But clearly through the supply side, the impacts will be negligible and will be mostly diluted on the complexity of the supply side. So those are the three elements that I will mention. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Maximo. Let's take the next three questions from in the room in a row. Please identify yourself.
Okay. My name is Joe Freeman. My question is, no one has mentioned culture, and yet food preparation and consumption is intimately tied into cultural traditions. Culture has to be changed at the grassroots. You can't mandate it from the top, and you can't tax it out of existence. Agencies can sponsor change agents, but it still has to be done at the grassroots. How do you change the culture of what people eat and how they prepare it to move it in a more healthy direction?
Good afternoon. My name is John. I think she just asked my second question. But the first question I want to ask is on the issue of tax. One of the recommended approach for tackling any cost is introducing new question to fund food system, new tax to fund food system transformation. In some parts of the world, lack of transparency and accountability in the use of public funds have reduced public confidence, and I'm kind of wondering how you will, what kind of recommendation you will give to some developing countries where transparency and accountability has been an issue, and how that may affect public trust in introducing new tax for food system transformation.
Hi, my name is Samah Sanman. I come from the East Africa private sector, and my question is really about food subsidies and removal of food subsidies. You see many countries, let me speak to the countries that I know in East Africa, are import dependent, experiencing high inflation, rapid currency devaluation, and then high levels of debt. And so a lot of the IFIs come in, and the first thing they want to do is remove subsidies, and one of the most primary subsidies is the food subsidy, and one of the most subsidized foods is bread. Then what you see is because of this equilibrium, the producers of bread then use a lot of toxic chemicals, carcinogenic chemicals, and you see a huge prevalence of that. And this, creates a lot of health problems, a lot of disease. So we, in general, have had a lot of hesitations around this removal of food subsidies, and I just wanted to seek your thoughts on that as a policy reform strategy. Thank you.
Okay, those are really rich questions. Can I ask you, Jessica, to talk about the role of culture? And we've had a whole host of questions coming online about how do we, the Eat Lancet series talked about shifting to healthy, sustainable diets, but consumers aren't actually shifting. What is required to make consumers change how they eat? And then I'd like to ask Danielle maybe to take the question on removing food subsidies, and maybe adding to that, I think, Maximo, you said there is not that much that developing countries can actually repurpose, but I would say probably in the realm of fertilizer subsidies, there is quite a bit that could be repurposed. So maybe, Danielle, you could speak a little bit to the political economy around subsidies in low-income countries. And then the tax question, Katerina, can I ask you to weigh in on that? Thanks.
Okay, great. On culture, it's such an important point, and I fully agree. But interestingly, culture around food is changing. It has been changing over decades, both positively and negatively, because a range of forces, be it urbanization, globalization, income growth, immigration into other countries. I'm sitting in New York, which is probably the melting pot of the world, of changing cultures day by day around food. And I think keeping traditions and culture is difficult. Traditional diets are largely disappearing. towards a more homogenized diet. We're all starting to consume the same things. So I think if we want to keep some of those traditions and cultures alive, we, of course, need a bottom-up approach and empowering people to ensure that those traditions are alive, from the elders to the young people that are embracing those cultures. But we also need the food system to help us along the way if we want to keep those cultures and traditions, ensuring that these foods are considered aspirational and that they're tasty and they're affordable for people. So I think it's a tough one, but I don't think it's that necessarily that people just need to shift and move away from their cultural and traditional diets. I think there's a whole range of where some people are holding on to those traditions, and others are vastly disappearing very quickly. I just wanted to add one other thing that came up earlier. You know, this is a great talk, and we all know that food systems need to transform, but we really need to bring the messages from these reports to other sectors, particularly the health sector. If they see some of these results, I think they would realize that food systems can be a vehicle to help make their jobs easier and reduce this burden. When we look at the training that health practitioners get, they get nothing on nutrition, food, and food systems. But if they see these costs and the potential impacts that they could make through a food and health system nexus, I think it's really important. So we need to get uncomfortable and start showing these messages to other systems and sectors that could make an impact too on the food system, not just the food system field. Thank you.
Thanks, Danielle.
Yeah, so on the questions, Salma's question on the subsidy issue, so I think there's a few different dimensions to this. I think, you know, one is, first, I've observed IFIs have become more savvy about the challenges of removing food subsidies. They focus a lot more on fuel subsidies a lot of the time, but you know, often fuel's necessary for processing. So we know, you know, wheat processing into bread in a place like Sudan, removing the fuel subsidy really was a problem for the cost of bread. So I think, you know, one is about, you know, some work at IFPRI and other colleagues have done about, you know, cash transfers can sometimes be better than food subsidy, and that allows people to not just have to buy subsidized bread, but they can, you know, choose, they maybe want a more diverse diet that they can now afford with a cash transfer rather than using particularly a bread subsidy or maize meal subsidy that you see in Southern Africa. And then the other option is providing subsidies for, you know, horticultural products, for fruits and vegetables before you remove the bread subsidy, right? So this goes back to my discussion about the policy feedback, right? Do the benefit first, provide an extra benefit to incentivize the more diverse diet, and then you can slowly retrench the cost on the more unhealthy diet. Repurposing the fertilizer in the global south is a big question as well. Here, I mean, I think there's been a push for many years to invest more in ag R&D. You know, not just, we know many, you know, African countries, for instance, their large share of their budget goes to fertilizer subsidy. It's politically beneficial. People can see, you know, you're handing out fertilizer bags. It can manifest in the next season. That's different than ag R&D, which has longer term, low visibility benefits, and so politicians are less incentivized to do that. But we do know that that's a big gap, and how we shift the incentives to do that is really key. Again, we've seen like a country like Cote d'Ivoire in the horticulture sector, in different types of horticultural producers have agreed to have an export tax on some of their commodities and have that reinvested into ag R&D for their products. So they see, that's again goes back to this earmarking approach where they can see the benefits.
On the question of accountability, thank you for the question. I think it's a really important point, and especially given the type of transition we're talking about. We're talking about something which is long-term, which requires lowering uncertainty, and you know, Yo was telling us about it. It requires lowering uncertainty for everybody involved in a very uncertain environment. And So I think that in general, the question of being transparent, being predictable, and showing a long-term direction is really key. On the specific of taxes, I was thinking there are actually some experiences from other sectors that we could use. And there is this very famous example, if you look at the subsidy reform in energy, which is what Iran has done. And there's a big debate about that. But one of the key figures that they did is they took away a fuel subsidy and they opened bank accounts for everybody in the country. So they basically, they reached millions of people who didn't have a bank account before, and they put the money in their bank account. So before the subsidy went away, people could see money on a bank account. They could go to a cash machine and see it. They wouldn't be able to spend it yet until the day they kind of turned it off. But this was really a supreme example of, I'm serious, I mean business. I told you I'm not going to give you money on, through the commodity. I'm going to give you money in your bank account and you can spend it whichever way you want. So I think the effort is really in kind of showing that you have this kind of long-term commitment. This is a lot about the earmarking that Danielle was talking about. So I think that's the way to go.
Great, thank you. We've been given 5 more minutes, so I'm going to ask a very important last question to Andrea, and I think it ties in nicely with your next SOFA. Could you speak about how food systems transformation must include reforestation and decreasing deforestation from palm oil, cocoa, coffee, et cetera? And maybe that's one of the solutions you'll be taking a closer look at.
Certainly. Actually, this is a pleasure because when I was at IFPRI many, many years ago, I used to, my work here and for my dissertation was on deforestation in Brazil and how to reduce it. So it's a theme close to my heart. Well, I think land use change in general, and we've talked about options and innovations we have to think through, and be it technologies, institutional dimensions that drive land use change. I think it's underrepresented in the FAO report to the extent that we capture only a small part of kind of a biodiversity impact of land use change. So it is, I think, key in terms of climate change mitigation, in terms of the options that are viable. And also on this note, environmental impacts seem small relative to the health costs, but they are 20% of these global costs. And also they are, in many countries, those environmental costs occur mostly at the primary production sector, and they are higher than the value of primary production. So at that entry point, they are extremely important. So I think land use and land use change, along with other environmental pathways, are highly relevant. So we shouldn't be distracted from this by the fact that the health costs are very high. And another point that I think is important, the SOFA report, and Yo mentioned this, the distinction between the hidden costs and the cost of transformation, right? So one thing is looking at how high the hidden costs are, and another is what can we do that is economically viable? And I think land use change is one of those areas where a lot can be done. And so I think it's spot on, this question. Thanks.
Great. What a very rich discussion. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our very distinguished set of speakers, to thank everybody who's here with us in person and online, our audience. Also very much want to thank IFPRI's event management team for organizing this hybrid event. Our next event is taking place next week on June 11th on famines and fragility, making humanitarian, developmental, and peace-building responses work. So I hope many of you will be able to join us for that on June 11th. And for those of you here in person, please let's continue the conversation over some coffee. Thanks so much, everybody.